Good evening. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young, and I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, California. Welcome to the Forum Online, our series of conversation with religious thinkers about faith and the important issues of our day. Could COVID-19 help us win the fight against climate change? Carbon emissions have dropped worldwide, and the pandemic has elicited a global response unlike anything we've ever seen before. The crisis and also represents an opportunity for all of us, scholars and activists, secular and religious teachers, the private sector as well as the public, to live and think about climate change from a different perspective. And to ask ourselves what actions people of faith can take to move life on this planet toward a genuinely sustainable future. My guest tonight is Philip Clayton, Ingram Chair at Claremont School of Theology, where he directs the PhD program in comparative theologies and philosophies. He's also the president of the Institute for Ecological Civilization, which works internationally to support innovations toward a sustainable society. His focus has turned increasingly to the intersection of climate science, ethics, religion, and social philosophy, which he describes as eco theology. Thanks so much for joining me tonight. I was just thinking that at each different phase of your career, your bio would sound just completely different. Last time you were on the forum in person 5 years ago, we talked a lot about science and theology. We talked about comparative theologies across various religions. And I'm very excited to be talking about the environment tonight. It's absolutely crucial issue. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot is the question, what is COVID-19 teaching us about the environment? What is it teaching us about God?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for having me, Malcolm, on the show. I'm trying to personify the idea that being a theologian is not boring. You don't just have to write about the same topics all the time. It's as rich and complex as the world around us. I think a theology that isn't incarnate in that way, that isn't deeply in touch with every dimension of our existence, individually and as communities, and social freedoms, justice issues, spirituality growth, doesn't sing in the way that a theology should sing, that a relevant notion of God should sing. COVID-19 looks like the worst possible news for the environmental movement. We just got word that the British government has delayed the Glasgow summit for an entire year. There's so much worry that companies are going to sneak in and take more opportunity for themselves to make money, to build us deeper and deeper into a carbon-fueled global economy. But I actually don't see that as the bottom line of what's happening. To me, it seems like it's opening up spaces of possibility that we dare not even think of before. I mean, we never could imagine before, for example, that walls could come down so quickly in response to a crisis, that governments could assert their power to redirect or to close businesses, that universities could collaborate internationally to look for solutions, not to worry about copyright and funding. Hundreds of thousands of people would volunteer to help. I mean, we've seen kinds of community emerge. And I think while we're technically still on a quasi-lockdown, it's time for us to stop and reflect on what we're seeing and ask, what spaces of possibility does this open up? How does it cause us to think differently about the human species and what we might be able to do in response to an even more major, deeper, long-term crisis opportunity that we face?
Yeah, I wonder too, just as a theologian, just how is your perception of God or your understanding of God, how's that connected with what's happening in this global pandemic?
Yeah. Now, I know that was a low and outside pitch to say something really optimistic, but to be really, really blunt, for me, and I think for a lot of others in the church or who reflect about the church, it was at first, especially in the way that COVID has unfolded in the United States, a deeply discouraging message about human nature.
Yeah.
It's been a time when some of those in power have exercised more for their own gain, when some groups have built up walls around themselves to protect themselves from, the evil other, and that instead of finding an interconnecting community in the way we'd look for, we've seen more fragmentation. And at moments like that, when you see humans acting in a selfish way, then inevitably for a lot of us, it makes God feel further away also. Just
Yeah,
as when we see community reaching out its arms, we feel the presence of God.
right.
Something that the Grace community talks a lot about, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because on one hand, we've learned just how important it is to be together in person, just like how, in such a deeply subconscious way, we're taking cues from one another, we're finding comfort in one another. That's our native realm, is to be with each other. I just even think of, after church on a Sunday, I would shake hands with 100, 200 people. I miss that in such a deep way. And yet it is showing us these possibilities for communication that we just hadn't thought very much about before. But I see things it's amazing to me how fast things become politicized. The wearing of masks, it becomes a political statement. Like, I'm on this side doing this with my mask, I'm on this side doing that with my mask. Even just like the whole question of opening churches, instead of having it be a conversation about, what is going to nourish society and feed people's souls and care for people, it becomes like largely a political issue. And I'm sad about that. I think part of it has to do with Christianity has this element in it, this kind of persecution complex element, which is in the earliest scriptures that we have, that, those New Testament texts about being persecuted by the Roman Empire, being persecuted by neighbors, it's still there. And even in our society, which is so, Christians have an outsized voice, it's upsetting that still rises to the surface.
Yeah. I think this is something that the theologian and the pastor share in common, which is to wish that all the language of religion can be deeply integrated into the warp and woof of everyday life. So at the time of grieving or family pressures or economic loss for many, many people in our country, but not only, and at a time of loss of family members, that we don't have a triumphant Christianity or Christianity, proudly proclaiming its rights, but a sort of quiet, like Paraclete in John, the Holy Spirit who comes alongside, or just the quietness, be still and know that I am God. That there is a time of grieving, of New York Philharmonia playing Brahms' Requiem.
Oh yeah.
And now, if the Philharmonic can do that, cannot the church also corporately grieve? Corporately grieve also the losses of some dreams, as we had to say to our children, no, America hasn't really come together, but it's become in some ways more politicized through this process. And if that God can walk through the valley of the shadow of death, if our faith can do that, then when we talk about opportunities now arising, there's more credibility. It doesn't feel like we denied, the darkness of a lot of these weeks that we've gone through.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's just, it's so interesting to see how it unfolds, because I think there's almost like it's almost like a 1 or 2 week news cycle. And news cycle is not the right word for it, because it's really kind of a global consciousness. 2 or 3 weeks ago, the first articles about how dangerous singing in public might be, and that's where we are in these. But in another 3 weeks, we're going to be having a different global conversation about a different aspect of COVID-19, and that's been interesting to me too, just that it's a global conversation. That's just, there's no way of getting around that anymore.
And I'd love to see Christian voices doing both sides of that conversation. The parts that are grief and our loss and our frustration and unknown and how difficult it is to be consoled. And then it's almost like with two friends, you earn the right to be encouraging to your friend by walking first with him or her through the sorrows and the loss.
Yeah.
And if we can do that a little bit more, then when you ask me or we ask others, so where's the hope in this? We have a little bit more credibility. So I'm trying to pause now and go still and recognize the sense of loss. I have a son who lives in Brooklyn, who is an actor, no job, not only now, but in the foreseeable future, with folks packing theaters in Broadway. And friends dying and incredible hunger, as we heard a little bit from Dean Daniel from the Cathedral in New York
right,
a few weeks ago on your program, right?
Yeah,
They're serving twice as many people and food than they were before. So if we're there, sort of where our sleeves rolled up helping, and then we pause and say, so now are there some sparks of hope here? And then we start to make that transition together.
Right. We had basically a funeral service for all the people who had died during this time of the pandemic in the Bay Area, but whom we couldn't observe their funerals. So we did that last week. It was a very powerful service.
Good for you.
But that's one of the things I like about ecological civilization is that there is like that sense of hope, of vision for a different kind of future. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what ecological civilization is, and just how your thought led you to that point to discuss the future in those terms.
Yeah, and Malcolm, it's actually a perfect transition from where we just were, because the term didn't come in as a panacea, but it evokes a twofold possibility. There's hope on both forks of the path, if you will, but one is a much easier path to walk, and the other one really is a walk through the valley of the shadow of death. So ecological civilization simply means a point in the future when humans are living in a sustainable way on the planet. That's very simple, right? Now, if humans never live on a sustainable way in the planet, then either we take ourselves off the planet at some point, right? We go extinct, or we don't live in any civilization at all. And I mean, we could imagine humans sort of falling back to a state where we're in the trees and unable to build a civilized way of living with each other. It's as Thomas Hobbes said in the 17th century, life becomes the war of all against all, and life becomes nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah.
So let's imagine that at some point in the future, we actually are living in a sustainable way on the planet. We have a form of civilization that integrates with each other in justice and integrates with all of the ecosystems, living things. Now, there are two ways that could go. We could see the warnings that are all around us now in our science, to our bare eyes, and we could begin to make that transition toward a sustainable civilization. And that's obviously what we hope in the Institute for Ecological Civilization, and what Pope Francis hopes in his appeal to integral ecology, which is a very closely allied notion. Or we can put our heads in the sand like an ostrich and not do anything and watch while this, push our foot even firmer onto the accelerator of our Hummers as we race along the freeways until off we go and, off the cliff, like, what was it, Harold and Maude, in full speed, out into the sunset over the Pacific. Either way, there's hope. If we begin to turn the ship now, tanker being a bad metaphor, or maybe a good one, if we begin to turn it now, then we don't have as great a losses. If we wait, then there'll be really some harsh decades to go through before we can make that transition, so that at least the remnant of us are able to learn from the mistakes and to live differently on this planet. But that's not something we want to bequeath to our grandchildren, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's part of the problem, is that we're so myopically focused on a very short period of time, our own lifetimes, and we don't have that vision to build things that last and that bring life to the earth instead of short-term profits.
The inspiration in the U.S. for the phrase ecological civilization is the eco theologian John Cobb, who held a conference in 1971, soon after Rachel Carson's book and came out and her work was influential, with the title, "Is It Too Late?"
Right.
1971, Is It Too Late? And began a process. He's now 95 and still actively involved. The term comes from China, where it actually became a part of the party platform in 2007 and the constitution in 2012. So this was expressed a hope in those years that China might be able to step over the modern development the way that Europe had done it, in such a devastating, disastrous way, and move to a sort of postmodern development. And that civilization, and they called an ecological civilization. That notion came into the United States through interactions with Chinese leaders and environmentalists. It led to a 1,500-person conference in 2015, and where the Claremont colleges were filled with these people from around the world, and I wish actually had 2,000 people at the major plenaries. Bill McKibben, one of the most visible environmentalists in the United States, through 350.org. Vandana Shiva, one of the most visible environmentalists from India. Sherry Liao and others. And out of that, we formed the Institute for Ecological Civilization to begin to see if we could get involved globally in thinking across the sectors of society. What would we have to do to begin to make this sector and this sector and this sector road mapping their way toward an ecological civilization? So that's the sort of broader frame.
You write a lot about China in your book, and I remember thinking in the early 90s about what would happen when China industrialized at the scale that North America did. What are some of the signs of hope that you see in terms of what they're capable of doing and what they're doing right, and where do they need to do more work in terms of their work towards an ecological civilization?
Yeah, it's really hard to get a clear sense of the situation in China, because the media available to us is so consistently negative.
Yeah.
And we're at a time when the US government is broadcasting a sort of tribalism, and it's more than just an isolationism. It's a hostility toward the global community. So I am not at all naive. I'm the president of an organization that works in China. I've written a best-selling book on the environmental movement in China that's in Chinese, and have been there multiple times a year since 2000, looking for the connections. At the peak, we had the view that though the majority still accepted a sort of economic globalization model, the majority of top government officials, that as many as a third of Chinese leaders had the vision of really doing it differently, not just repeating the patterns of the West. China's amazing. We just got the news. During COVID testing in Wuhan, they were going to test, and they successfully tested, we read this morning, 6.5 million people for COVID, finding 200 positives. And they did that in less than 2 weeks.
Wow. Yeah.
So I happen to live in a state called California, where many, many years ago, we thought maybe there'd be one high-speed rail from San Francisco to LA.
Right.
Right. And I don't know that we've made it much closer to that. In those years, China first built 10,000 kilometers of high-speed electric rail and is now beyond 20,000 kilometers. China said we're going to invest in solar panels and became in 18 months or something the world's largest supplier of solar panels. So there are possibilities to do things in China. It's not gentle. It does not have the care for everyone who might be in the way. I've watched villages being torn down so that the high-speed rail could go through. But if there's a global crisis, if it's a time when one really has to say, stop, the old way of doing business isn't going to work, we have to do this differently, then China's a model of what that sort of wartime footing looks like. And interestingly, we've seen some of that. The Bay Area counties shut down, right? First time in any of our lifetimes that we're told, stay at home. I'm fifth generation Northern Californian. Nothing since great-great-grandpa Littlejohn has ever sounded like that before. So maybe there's some things we can learn about that opening. I'm on a national conference in China, Sunday morning China time, so Saturday night, talking about what can we do after COVID to continue the movement toward a sustainable civilization.
Yeah. When you think about your childhood, I mean, what are some of your earliest memories of the natural world? What formed such a deep attachment for you in your life and your work that's still guiding you and directing you all these years later?
You told me you were going to ask that, and so what I would like to do is maybe just share a picture of it.
That'd be great.
Allowed
that'd be great.
So I'm from the Santa Rosa. I was born in Berkeley, but grew up in Santa Rosa. And that means the redwood forests are my home ecosystem. I used to do a project for 7-8 years with Jane Goodall, who I think is one of the real saints of the world. And she said, as she traveled the world and founded these programs she called Roots and Shoots, she would help each child find a bit of the world that they loved. And so what I think is that there's a way in which we have to tell what is our love story. Do you see that on the screen?
No, I can just see you.
Oh, okay. I'm going to reshare that in a moment. And I think that we have to be able to find out what it is. How's that? Now can you see it?
It's just about to, yep, there goes. Love story.
Okay. Yeah. So this is a spot above Fort Ross on the Northern California coast, a short drive from where I grew up. And when my mother died and my sister and I were wandering, looking for a place to sort of do the grieving, we found this spot where you could look 360 degrees and not see a house, a road, or a telephone wire. The wind whistles up from the coast and you can just hear the waves hitting the coast down below. Those are those rolling Northern California hills with the fog coming in from the distance. And I had to say, you know, if my spirit were able to come back after death and be present at some place, this is the place that I would want to come back to. It's something that's so deeply embedded in my genes for 5 generations, but also my sense of what beauty in the world is, that I can't imagine another place on this planet that would feel as much like home.
You know, it's
I wonder
funny,
if the environmentalism doesn't start there.
Yeah, as you show the pictures, I can smell the smells of the chaparral and the toyon and the madrone and the smell of the soil. Those are powerful images for me too. I mean, this is definitely my home, and that's one of the things I've been thinking about so much. When I was at Berkeley as a student, I used to spend hours, hundreds of hours a semester, just combing Strawberry Canyon, the hills behind the university. And so I knew like every little grove of redwood trees, you know, every place where the forget-me-not flowers would blossom in the springtime. I mean, I really knew it. And over 30 years, 40 years, I see it starting to degrade. You know, I mean, it's just, and I mean, some of it may be just like the flora and fauna just aging, but a lot of it's just getting drier. And it's just, it's not what it was. So it's just strange to see change like that just over such a short period of time.
So maybe we're actually at the heart of the question that you posed for today, Malcolm. And maybe that is, how do we transition from a COVID-19 crisis toward global progress, moving beyond climate change and learning to live sustainability on the planet? I think what we just did, if you allow me, I'm going to do it here with a quote from Mark Wallace. Maybe it is that the global environmental crisis is a matter of the heart, not the head. I can't give you reasons and scientific facts, but it's that we no longer experience our co-belonging with nature in such a way that we're willing to alter our lifestyles in order to build a more sustainable future. Co-belonging. Stephanie Mills puts it in more spiritual terms. What restoration could and should be for in us is the transformation of our souls. In addition to what this work might accomplish in the land, I yearn for it as the yoga that will cause us to evolve spiritually, that will restore to us a feeling of awe in something besides our own conceits. Isn't that beautiful?
Oh, it's beautiful. I mean, again, it's just like, for my whole life, I've made that a part of my weekly life to stop and smell the roses, to, you know, take time to notice what was happening in the natural world around me. I mean, I used to be able to say exactly where on the horizon the sun could set at, you know, particular season of the year. But even last night, we have so much fog in San Francisco. It was one of the few nights where you could see the constellations. And it just, even those are just they're such a deep part of my faith and my piety and my spirituality. And, you know, I know that they're what feed me and care for me.
Yeah. So I'm tempted to share a poem from Jeffers, who's our poet of the Pacific Coast.
Is.
Can I,
You gotta,
will
you
you allow
gotta
me?
do
And
it.
then I know you want to do like brainy questions, but I'm so passionate about the beauty. Can I just share this one?
Yeah,
Little
do.
stuff.
So, you know what you should do is you read Robinson Jeffers in a natural place while listening to John Adams' The Dharma at Big Sur.
Yes, that is perfect. Or yeah, be it Esalen. I entered the life of the brown forest and the great life of the ancient peaks, the patience of stone. I felt the changes in the veins in the throat of the mountain, and I was the stream, draining the mountain wood and the stag drinking. And I was the stars boiling with light, wandering alone, each one the lord of his own summit. And I was the darkness outside the stars. I included them. They were part of me. I was mankind also, a moving lichen on the cheek of the round stone. They have not made words for it.
That's great. I love his collected poems. It's one of my most treasured books. You know, I wonder, that's one of the things I think about. Are there theological convictions and religious ideas that are just more conducive toward a healthy environment, a thriving natural world? I know you must have thought about that so much.
Yeah, so theology is not like a pre-made, pre-delivered dinner. Theology for me begins with the life and manner of teaching of Jesus called the Christ. It begins with the parables, as the Jesus Seminar often pointed out. It begins with the incomprehensible sayings. You know, the people say, well, we wonder a lot of whether Jesus really spoke these words, but there are a couple that we're really sure of, and they choose the ones that are most perplexing, the most like koans, right? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and what is unto God what is God's. One of the sentences that virtually every scholar says that would be traced back to Jesus. So we have his way of living, we have his teaching, and then we have the earliest strata of teaching, the earliest hymn of the Christian church, we think, recorded in Philippians chapter 2, which is the canonic passage. Being in the very form of God, did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of man. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. Those are the living, breathing, throbbing heartbeats of Christianity. And the theologian is the musician who listens to that and listens to its expression in the spirituality of the church, in the liturgy of the church, in the social ministries of the church, and then says, with that throbbing in my soul and that heartbeat that I can feel, the warm blood of Christianity running through me, how shall we speak to this issue? Slavery in the United States, women treated as second-class persons, again, blacks treated as second-class persons in the 50s and 60s, the gay community and our ability to be fully integrated into society. Step by step by step, we ask of new questions of a newly emerging world. What are the resources in this homeless rabbi who walked the dusty roads of Palestine? And eco theology is just that process, heard yet once more in the context of a world in crisis.
Yeah. You know, when I think of your work, I can't help but think about your work on religion and science, theology and science, and you know, I wonder how you got to having that as being such a focal point of your interest, and then you know what you're kind of carrying forward from that work that you did that was so important. I have, you know, your book, God and Contemporary Science with me, and it's got this wonderful, it's inscribed by you, and it was a gift to my friend Owen Thomas.
Oh,
I just
Owen is
treasure
a
this
very special friend.
Yeah, and it has this marginalia in it. But I mean, so this Philip Clayton, where did this person come from, and what is you know, how is that going forward in your life right now?
I just wrote wrote that up recently for a book that we just published with Monkfish. And I do it because many people you've had in the forum over the years were in this book. It was called, let's see if I can get it right, How I Found God in Everyone and Everywhere, an anthology of spiritual memoirs.
Mm.
And it includes Deepak Chopra, Richard Rohr, Matthew Fox, Rupert Sheldrake, Cynthia Bourgeot, amazing author, Ilia Delio, many, many others, Rabbi Artson, many people that you've known through the years. And for me, the religion science came in its deepest level from a Quaker mother and the Northern California coast.
Yeah.
So I bared my heart to you when I showed you the pictures from above Fort Ross, no question. And then I needed to find some way as a young man to rebel against my liberal Bay Area parents who just had no boundaries and everything was fine. You know, I'm gay, no problem. I'm, whatever, using drugs. Nothing would catch their attention. So one day I came home from a Christian camp near Santa Cruz, Mount Herman, I think it was called.
Right, Mount Herman, still there.
Okay. And said, I just got Jesus. And they were devastated. My father, a literature professor at Sonoma State College at that time, who believed that the truth was in every book, and suddenly said, no, it's all in one book. And there's Adam and Eve, and there was this garden, and then they sinned, and now God's really mad at everyone, and if you don't accept Jesus, you're really in trouble. I remember the breakfast and watching my mother cry gently into her Cheerios.
Oh.
Like how they had lost their son to the worst possible outcome. But that gave me a program, reconcile the truth of Christianity with contemporary science. So that was a project for some years. And as time goes by, we sort of mellow and we look for what's most important. The science, as the world changed, increasingly my study turned to environmental sciences, climate science, and the religion turned from the big metaphysical questions to questions of religion's ability to motivate how we live in the world. And that led me then to eco theology and to the attempt to move the needle a little bit. As we ask government leaders around the world, what are the steps you can do to move us? Just one example that just arose last week, so I'm really excited. There's an international program called the Well-Being Economy Alliance. They work with a number of countries around the world. I think they have Canada, Singapore, they have New Zealand, Iceland, and they said, well, maybe as the fifth country, Scotland, the sixth country will invite California. So the Institute for Ecological Civilization just received a grant to begin working with California leaders. What would it be if we built our economy as a well-being economy alliance? A kind of economy that would support a sustainable state, sustainable life in this state for decades or centuries to come. So and then the Bay Area will be the center for the meetings, and over the coming year, whether they're virtual or face-to-face, we'll be working with Bay Area leaders and Sacramento leaders to see if we can move that forward. Do you see what I mean? That's religion and science, but now in a way that really makes a difference.
Right. I mean, for me, this it's religion and the social sciences. This is my book that I published a few years ago about the environment and economics, and just and you're so right. I mean, there's so many principles of economic thinking that are really being reevaluated now, just in our new situation. And my prayer is that the people who are making those changes, are able to find some way to have them become part of the political landscape too. So it's just like we need to change the way we think, but then we also need to change, our governmental policies, how we set up markets, how we, legislate, economic activity, et cetera.
Well, Malcolm, be careful. If you hold up your book and you talk like that, I just might ask you right on the forum if you join the board of advisors for California Well-Being Economy.
Wow.
As a published author in this area and a well-known Bay Area figure.
I would love to do it. Yeah, exactly. I'm so glad we finally got around to it.
I was feeling shy about asking you, but I thought if I asked you in public, it would.
That's perfect.
Exciting.
I can't wait to get the materials.
I think the message, where our conversation is taking us, is we talked about the COVID crisis, We talked about the way we live on the planet as being a matter of the heart and our fundamental spirituality. And then we've taken broad, brainy things like metaphysics and theology and science and religion, and following that lead, turned them into serving the heart and the conscience as a form of Christian incarnation in the world, for the world.
That's exactly right. I mean, here's a question I think pretty much every week of my life. If you had a massive Gothic cathedral in the tech capital of the world, like what would you
take a random example?
What would you do with it? I mean, it's just it is a strange. Northern California brings together ancient traditions and wisdom and things from the East and things from the West. I do really think that there's a kind of nexus here, a kind of connection that can really. Did you ever read Richard Register's book, Eco City Berkeley? I've been thinking about that book so much lately. But that ecological consciousness is a part of our regional culture.
Well, since it seems to be where our conversation is evolving, what if we dreamed big? Because it is sort of the theme that you chose for the forum this week. COVID-19, a major response to climate change. And say the title of the Berkeley book, because I want to go read it afterwards. Say it again.
Eco City Berkeley by Richard Register. It'll be in your library there. But it does give you this. It's been so much on my mind lately. It gives you this picture of how things felt in the later 70s, early 80s, and people can say, "Oh, that was naive thinking," or they didn't have any idea what was coming up, or didn't focus enough on the policy issues having to do with global climate change. I mean, there's a zillion criticisms you could have for it, but I mean, it really took seriously. Like, what would our life on the ground look like if we dedicated more of our lives to working towards caring for the environment than multiplying our gross domestic product?
Yeah, these are called among millennials social imaginaries. Social imaginaries. It's the response to this dystopian way of thinking that so dominates Hollywood and novels like McCormack's On the Road.
Oh yeah, you mentioned that. That was the most terrifying book I ever read. I mean, I wish I hadn't read it, but you mentioned it in your book.
So instead of focusing on dystopias, let's focus on books like that, or another one from a few decades back is called Ecotopia.
Yes, I love
by Ernst Kallenbach. And the premise is beautiful. Northern California, Oregon and Washington split off from the United States, and they have some kind of defense where no one dares come in. For 20 years, they build an ecotopia. And the major part of the book is set in the city, in San Francisco, and it's completely changed. So is it possible that we in Northern California could say, maybe in contradistinction to the rest of the US, we're actually going to invest in a way of living on this planet that's sustainable, radically different?
I love that book. I'm so glad you mentioned it. I read it, in 1983 or something, or I don't know, 88, 92. I just haven't thought of it in so long. Yeah. But you're right. It's like almost a genre of environmental literature to imagine, different outcomes than the one that the trajectory that we're on. Yeah. We have a tradition that you probably remember. We take questions from people, and Rebecca, it will take the questions that people put in the question and answer box. So there are different mediums that were, one's on Facebook, one's YouTube, one's Boxcast, but she'll collect those. So if you have questions for either of us, for Philip or me, please send them in. One of the things I think about too is you've done so much work on world religions, and I wonder if you think about just kind of like that element when it comes to the environment, and what resources do you see in other world religions that are inspiring for people in our situation?
Yeah, there's so many of the other religions that are naturally ecological. I think Christianity and Islam have had to struggle to find the environmental gospel, the love for the planet. For Christians, we had to fight against subdue the earth, which many of us believe was a misinterpretation of Genesis 1. But for other religions, that connection is already given at the heart of the faith. More than anything else, that's true of the indigenous traditions, the most ancient spiritual traditions on the planet. Virtually every religious tradition has an understanding of the sacredness of place. It's this river or this mountain, this wind. I encourage people to check out the Seventh Generation Fund, a website for Christopher Peters is still, I think, the executive director in Northern California, where they help indigenous people, youth, to re-engage in the way of living close to the planet. More than anything else, we have to learn from what are called the life ways of indigenous peoples. Not to romanticize, not that we would then become them, but that we would at least hear echoes, a little bit of guidance from what they have to offer. Beyond that, many of the religions of the book, as they're often called, have that kind of closeness built in. I think first of Taoism, many people in the Bay Area read Tao Te Ching and know of what it is to understand ourselves as parts of something far deeper, something that interfuses all things, the Tao, which gave rise to Yin and Yang, and then the one, the two, and the 10,000, which means all other things, that we recognize a sort of spiritual unity underlying all other things. It's present in Confucianism with the sacred triangle of the heaven, Tian, the nature and humanity, interconnected and needing to be in a harmonious relationship. It's in the core of the teachings of the Buddha in something called Pratitya Samutpada, or codependent arising. Your action, this being given, that arises. And one set of causes and conditions flow through all things. It is the ecological religion par excellence. From that notion of interdependence at the heart of the teaching of the Buddha, all environmental philosophy, all environmental ethics follow, as the Dalai Lama has so beautifully shown. And I think, finally, that in the Hindu traditions of Vedanta, the way that everything exists as a mode or expression of the one Brahman. Brahman has the features of Chat, Chit, Ananda, so being, consciousness, and bliss, Ananda. And we all participate in that. Every Atman is part of the essence, part of the being of that greatest one. From those traditions, I believe Christians need to have the humility to hear that music and to listen for it, however faintly, in our own tradition, and to see whether we could learn to look at our own scriptures more carefully in light of the richness of theirs.
Yeah. So I'm starting to have some questions coming in. And here's the first one. Do you know about the book Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire by Rebecca Henderson? And the following question with it is, do you think we're outgrowing capitalism?
Yes, I do know that book, and that's brilliant. I want you to read the title and the author again so that others
it's
can note it down.
Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, and it's by Rebecca Henderson.
No individual system by itself suffices for the kind of radical change we need to make. But there are systems that are inherently at odds with our reaching a sustainable or ecological civilization. And unrestrained capitalism is definitely in that category. The capitalism of unrestrained growth says that all economics have to be built so that it spins more and more and more, that economic activity is higher and higher and higher on a finite planet. A sixth grader can see that that is contradictory.
Right.
I had the privilege of working with Chinese co-authors to do a book called Organic Marxism, an alternative to capitalism and ecological catastrophe. And there are many features of a way of thinking where we, the group, the communities, put our common good ahead of the individual's wishes for his or her lifestyle. That was the core idea there. And yet we can see from China's own struggles now, especially with the use of coal, that a Marxist-based nation doesn't necessarily mean economic policies.
Right.
But I do want to strongly say, and I actually say this as a Christian and part of a long Christian tradition of placing community and the common good first, that we really need to be suspicious of an economic system that says if you maximize your own self-gain, if you maximize your wealth, you're helping the planet the most. And I just don't think that stands up to even a little bit of reflection.
Yeah, it's almost like an idolatrous myth. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, it's hard to see what kind of empirical evidence there is that supports that hypothesis.
Well, let me just be fair. When there is a small number of humans on the planet,
Right.
then we do our trade, and the world around us, as in classical capitalist economics, is called an externality.
Yeah, yeah.
You don't compute it in, you just draw from resources, and they are, for practical purposes, unlimited if there are 100 million humans on the entire planet. Right? But as we approach 8 billion humans, where there's no spot on the planet where you cannot measure the hand of man, the top of Mount Everest, the deepest places of the Pacific. We've just found that microplastics on the surface of the oceans are far, far higher than we estimated before. And I could go on and on with the climate data. Most people know that already. We just have to say externalities no longer exist.
Yeah.
We are a single interlocking system, and every capitalist step, every economic activity you or I engage in is drawing from a very limited set of resources.
Yeah, and that's part of it. As I think, the capitalist system evolved to solve certain kinds of problems, and it's generated certain kinds of other outcomes. And so, no human system is going to be put in place and be the final end all for all human beings from then on. It's just natural for us and our social circumstances to have those evolve over time, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the limits to methods of organizing human societies that came into being, 200 or 300 years ago.
Yeah, wasn't it the Bay Area? Wasn't even Stanford where F. Schumacher wrote "Small is Beautiful"?
Yeah, exactly. Right? Small is beautiful. Exactly. Yeah, completely.
It's almost like, and this is also a COVID-related theme. Do you remember the days when you would walk out on the streets and just see dads or moms with little kids and bicycles and no cars going by on a lot of the streets?
Yeah.
And suddenly there was a joy of doing what I, as a child in a German village, did, of just being outdoors without any transportation except what your legs could get you to.
Yeah.
Small is beautiful. The simplicity that became a part of a lot of our lifestyles as we went into lockdown. Is there something there that resonates with what we've just said about capitalism and the need for restraint? And also where our faith takes us toward the simple, the beautiful, the communal.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a part of the vision that's being held out for us in these last months.
And that's part of it. I mean, we live near the Presidio golf course, and I mean, they were wonderful to just open it to everybody. And it was kind of upsetting. Sometimes you see somebody riding their bicycle across the green, and you think, "Oh, is that going to ruin it?" But you could see how much people loved and cared for it. It's almost like we need kind of a new Sabbath, because we're so addicted to our work lives and our career lives. I mean, people in a certain social group are, but it has an outsized influence on just how what we think our careers are supposed to give us. Do you know what I mean, in terms of meaning?
Actually, Malcolm, that's a beautiful thought of how we could do eco theology in the context of the Christian tradition. So we take Sabbath, Shabbat, from that we have learned from Hebrew Jewish practices, and now we bring the ear listening for the music of a link to ecosystems. So in eco theology of the Sabbath, well, Shabbat is the time of rest, and it's the time of the celebration of all creation on the seventh day. So now Sabbath, including the worship service we're involved in, have that resonance of the planet around us. And the choice of liturgy and the choice of music is is done in such a way that it fosters that sense of the celebration of all community, and not just the Book of Hebrews idea of, well, there's the eschatological kingdom, but no, what the first Shabbat was, which was a celebration of God's creation.
Right. I wonder if is there a tension between, people who are asserting kind of just like the religious freedom to just do whatever the heck you want to do, and, a more society-wide approach to caring for the environment. It's just, I wonder if you've been reflecting on that at all lately.
Mm-hmm. From the individualistic, you mean?
Yeah, just there is that individualism of just like the don't tread on me element of don't tell me what to do, don't tell me what mask to wear or what days to work, or that I can't go across the Golden Gate Bridge on a on a certain day, or
it's somehow that's tied in with the topic we were just discussing, which is the capitalism. If we take the individual as the atom, as the island unto himself, right? I'm thinking of No Man is an Island.
Right, completely, John Donne.
But the John Donne couplet. But if we aren't going to accept an unrestrained capitalism, the right to as much money as I can acquire and spend, and in many resources as I can afford to consume, we don't take that atomistic individualism as the core of what we do. What's the alternative? We think of ecological civilization in a very simple sort of mantra: communities of communities of communities of communities. So the family or the couple or the friends walking in those early weeks of COVID, the community of those who begin to share, to help, to bring food to the door of an older person who can't get out, or to do the shopping for him or her, right? People who are at more risk to go outside their doors.
Right, exactly.
The community of, what was I just reading in New York? The New Yorker yesterday had an article, or last week, an article of, it was Massachusetts, and the local farmer's market just put the fruits and vegetables on the side of the road on the honor system, because nobody wanted to be selling.
Right.
So the vegetables are there and people just leave the money as requested. Communities of communities. That, to me, is a beautiful, moving alternative to that, if I may say, disgusting, selfish individualism.
Yeah. And it's an extreme, and the last time I talked to you, it was before the current president was elected. I wonder just if there's something that you've learned just by what we've experienced with the current presidential administration over the last few years, and just what's your take on it in terms of, it feels different now than it did in, say, January 2017. And I just wondered what your thoughts about it are.
Yeah. It gets to the point, one doesn't want to, jinx it by being too optimistic, but it gets to the point where you can imagine history saying a few decades from now, so the US tried out the most selfish imaginable form of politics, where one's own interest ruled one's decision making and no higher standard existed. I mean, there was such a noble rhetoric of Barack Obama as he entered the presidency. And as an alternative came somebody who Twitter even has to censor the president of the United States, we found out yesterday in the New York Times. But now I wonder if history will say, so we got to look at that, and we as a people recoiled from what we saw of ourselves.
Yeah.
Our churches and religious communities justifying unrestrained freedom of desire, for whatever they want for the populace, and community being subordinated to individual wish.
Right.
I would love to think that what we'll see in an overwhelming election in the fall will be a no to that, and that the history books will say Americans saw 100,000 and whatever it's going to be, Americans die, and said no more.
Yeah, it does remind me a little bit of just California politics in the 90s. I mean, it was just like there was this anxiety about the foreigner, or that the white people were not going to control the state life anymore. And it's just like a lot of ugliness just in the political scene. And it does remind me a little bit of that. But maybe I don't know if it's more extreme or not, but it does remind me of that transition period.
And for us, since the religious context is a part of our discussion, I would say I'm not as surprised that politics could be mean and dirty and selfish. We kind of expect that of wherever power congregates.
Yeah.
What I would most love to see, and pray that we will see, is that religion, that our spirituality will call us from selfishness to a sense of the common good, the other, especially the abused and oppressed and poor other, and to a spirituality that connects with all living, breathing things, an eco-spirituality. If during the election we see religious voices of whatever tradition calling us to a higher good, and we see people responding to that call, then I think we can begin the next 4-year period with a little bit more optimism and a little bit less despair about human nature than we've seen.
You've been around for a while, and you're just, the work that you do brings you into contact with younger people. What is your message to younger people these days, as somebody who's seen a lot of change in his life?
Mm-hmm. The younger generation that we think of more now are the ones called millennials, people born roughly between 1980 and 2000, give or take. And for a long time, scholars of religion and the Pew surveys found a kind of idealism in millennials that we hadn't seen in Gen X, the Gen Xers that preceded them. And we definitely had not seen in the baby boomers, the most selfish generation in the history of the planet, sadly. On baby boomer watch, more wrong was done and more long-term damage was done than in any previous generation. Now millennials are, or before COVID, were the majority in the workforce. And the question is, as they begin to have families and gain some personal wealth, will we see that idealism die, or will it transmute into other interesting forms? This is crucial not only because they are moving into the positions of power, but because Gen Z, the younger ones now, so people born 2000 roughly and beyond, have become in many ways the most disconnected and cynical generation in recent memory. And one would really hope that we would see models in ways that millennials begin to exercise their power, their leadership roles in society, in the church including, right?
Yeah.
I kind of want to turn the question back to you, Malcolm, and say, do you see some of those signs and dynamics within churches?
I do see. I see so many signs of hope. I mean, just among the newly ordained clergy, the people who come to yoga, we have 600 or 700 people who used to come to yoga practice, and it includes everybody. I mean, we have older people in wheelchairs, and we have professional athletes. But just the average age is much younger than me, and they're interested in the world. They're passionate about what's going on. These are people who really care, and maybe it's the people I'm exposed to. There's like selection bias and all that, but I really do have even just their ability to work technologies and to understand communication and to talk about. I mean, we just had no vocabulary for talking about like someone's brand, and just like, how do you project yourself in the world? What do you stand for? What symbols are associated with you? I mean, they're so sophisticated in some ways and so passionate in others. So, I'm really pleased with what when I leave this planet. I feel like the people who are coming along next are going to be good caretakers of things. I hope that turns out to be true.
Yeah, I also want to think that this is that kind of a moment. It's a moment when we're out of our cars, or we were for a while, and some of us still are, and our airplanes. It's a moment when the skies are bluer than they've been for years, and we can hear birds again. I remember taking a walk 6 weeks ago and seeing families on bikes on streets, something I had not seen. there's a heightened consciousness right now of how we and our communities and our environment, that we're all interconnected. We're sourcing things locally. We're recognizing that, I don't know if you know, but grocery stores are out hunting to find what are local farmers producing, because we can't bring the stuff in from South Africa any longer. So actually changes are happening in a community-supported agriculture around the country. We're publishing a book called What We're Learning About What's Possible. What we're learning about what's possible. And so that's the message I most want to get across. Let's slow down and stop. Yoga is about pausing to be aware. Buddhist meditation is about pausing to be aware. Let's be yogas and Buddhists and look around us. What are we learning about what's possible? And let's hold on to this moment. It's going to go away if we don't capture it. But if we can say, whoa, things are possible we could not even imagine, then we have a resource inside, a sense of possibility, which means a sense of empowerment as we go into the transitions of the coming months.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I can't believe we're out of time. I have a zillion other questions for you that are on my little sheets here about Claremont Theological School, the current state of Christianity, the work that you did in transforming Christian theology and where that's led you. But we just don't have enough time. We're just going to have to get together again.
It was fun. I think we talked about the important questions, and I hope it was helpful for the community of people that you helped to lead and those who are listening in today. I appreciate the chance to be with you, Malcolm.
It's been great. And everybody else, please join me next week when my guest will be Wendy Doniger, one of the world's foremost scholars on Hinduism. And you can help us to bring the arts to life at Grace Cathedral with a gift today to the forum. Please visit gracecathedral.org/donate to give. Thank you for joining the forum online. And thanks again so much to Philip Clayton. You've always been a kind of hero to me, and I'm so grateful that you agreed to be on the show today. Thanks for watching, everyone. Good night.